Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. A new book shares an investigation into White House advisor Stephen Miller and his impact on the Trump administration's policies. Award-winning investigative border journalist Jean Guerrero shares Miller's biography and how he rose to become an influential advisor to President Trump. The book investigates the administration's tough policies and rhetoric against immigrants, asylum seekers, and those on the left. The book, Hatemonger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda is out now. It is written by award-winning investigative journalist Jean Guerrero, who joins us now. Jean, thank you so much for joining us and congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Anthony. Great to be here.
Now, could you share with us why such an interest in this topic?
I first became interested in Stephen Miller while I was covering the family separation crisis. I heard this disconnect between what the White House was saying that these policies were about and what was actually happening on the ground. Most of the people that I was interviewing who were being affected by policies like the family separation policy and other policies that Stephen Miller designed were people who had not broken any laws, who had presented at ports of entry to ask for asylum the legal way. I interviewed a father from El Salvador whose 1-year-old toddler, Mateo, had been taken away from him after he presented legally and asked for asylum because he feared persecution at home in El Salvador. And his boy was taken from him and he was separated from him for 8 months. And, cases like these just made me really start to wonder, because there was this narrative that these policies are about law and order, that they're about, just enforcing the law. It's just about national security. But I was on the ground and I knew that that wasn't the case because they were cracking down on people who hadn't broken any laws. So for me, that raised the question, if this isn't about law and order, then what is it about? And that's what ultimately led me to turn to Stephen Miller and really want to understand the man who is behind these policies. And when I learned that Stephen Miller grew up in Southern California during the 90s, which is the same time that I grew up in Southern California, I became all the more fascinated with wanting to understand, how does a Jewish American descendant of refugees end up crafting Trump's harshest rhetoric and policies targeting people fleeing violence and persecution, people like his grandparents.
Yeah, exactly. And you detail this in the book. You really go back and spend some time actually on Stephen Miller's high school days, going back that far, and interviewed people who knew him in high school, friends and an advisor. So share with us what you found out about his early years in high school.
Well, from the time that Stephen Miller was a teenager growing up in liberal Santa Monica, California, he was expressing racist viewpoints, breaking up with a Mexican friend because of his Latino heritage, going around telling his Mexican classmates to speak English and to go back home to their countries if they couldn't learn the American way. He would go to school board meetings to argue against measures to improve racial equity in the school. So from a very young age, just very outspoken and very passionate about these issues in a way that was surprising to people. And the more that I dug for the book, Hatemonger, the more I began to realize that this is a case study in radicalization. Stephen Miller, was going through a hard time during this period in his life. His family, his father, who's in real estate, had lost a lot of money related to various bankruptcies and legal disputes, as well as an earthquake that affected his business. So they had to move to a less affluent part of town. So Stephen Miller was feeling displaced. He was feeling lost. He was feeling angry, just the typical profile of someone who is easily radicalized. And this is when he meets David Horowitz, who is a former Marxist turned conservative writer who who ends up becoming like a father figure to Stephen Miller, starting during the time when he's a teenager. He meets him through the school, and then he kind of nurtures him throughout his career, finds him his first jobs on Capitol Hill, and even was feeding, explosive talking points and strategy papers and policies through Miller, through his time working for the Trump campaign.
Yeah.
But going back to his time as a teenager, David Horowitz introduced Miller to the fantasy that he had to save the United States from certain destruction in the form of the Democratic Party partnering with Muslims and other people of color to allegedly tear down this country. He really sells this idea to young conservatives that everything that we hold dear in society as Americans is a result of white men, and that anyone who dares to question white patriarchal superiority is trying to destroy America. So Stephen Miller finds purpose in this mission, and David Horowitz gives him the tools to fight this mission. He teaches him to invert the language of the civil rights movement against it, so calling liberals and people of color racists and oppressive elites. And so just really completely inverting these narratives.
Yeah.
And he just continued to have an impact. Private correspondence that I obtained for the book shows him continuing to have an impact through the campaign and through Miller. And essentially it boils down to David Horowitz and other extremists taught Stephen Miller at a very young age how to launder white supremacist viewpoints through the language of heritage and the language of economics and the language of national security in order to make it palatable to the mainstream.
Now, how in the book you also talk about the impact that 9/11 had on Stephen Miller. Can you kind of share with us how that maybe could have shaped some of his views?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the time period in which Stephen Miller grew up is a character in and of itself, like the place and the time period, because initially there was this scapegoating of immigrants statewide in California at the time. He grew up during the 90s when there was this really like anti-immigrant hostility. Republican Governor Pete Wilson was blaming all of the state's fiscal problems on the quote invasion at the border. There were attacks on social services for children of the undocumented. There were attacks on bilingual education, attacks on affirmative action. So really like this idea that immigrants, especially Mexicans, were bad and destroying society. Then comes 9/11. So already Stephen Miller is internalizing these ideas that like brown people are destroying his home. And then comes 9/11, and that ends up being a huge turning point for him, according to the reporting from my book, from my conversations with his friends. That's when Stephen Miller starts becoming really, really vocal. Even though he was as far as he could be from the 9/11 terrorist attacks in California, it really struck him at a deep personal level. And he began to go on the Larry Elder Show, which is this locally based talk radio show, to complain about how his school was not sufficiently patriotic, and he wanted them to instate the requirement of a Pledge of Allegiance every day, and he was upset that they weren't doing that. And so just going on this radio program to complain about his school's lack of patriotism in response to the 9/11 attacks. And that's actually when, David Horowitz is listening. He hears this young teenager and his furious rants on the radio and becomes very intrigued by him. Steve Bannon was listening as well, Alex Marlow, like all these key right-wing figures who went on to play an important role in shaping Trumpism. They were listening to this teenage Stephen Miller, on the Larry Elder Show, complaining about multiculturalism and complaining about his classmates and his school administrators.
So do you think during this time is when Miller discovered how powerful the media could be in using that as a format to shape some of these views that he was indoctrinated with?
That's a great question, because the media absolutely has played such an integral role in the power that Stephen Miller has been able to have, throughout his time as a teenager and then throughout his time with Trump. And you're exactly right. This is when he learned the power of it, because as a result of him going on talk radio to complain about his school. His school instated the Pledge of Allegiance, so he was able to put pressure on the school to do something by publicly shaming them. And so he realized that the media was a very potent tool, and you later on see him building alliances with really combative media personalities like Ann Coulter and Tucker Carlson, and Rush Limbaugh becomes a huge fan of Stephen Miller's. But specifically, you see him working very closely with the right-wing blog Breitbart throughout his time working for Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, and then when he was on the Trump campaign, to really ram through an anti-immigrant hostility and anti-Muslim hostility, and particularly to paint brown and Black people as an existential threat. So going back to this idea that David Horowitz taught him, that he has to save the country from, the grave threat of multiculturalism. So he was feeding white supremacist and white nationalist websites and literature to Breitbart and urging them to turn these into stories and make these views more mainstream.
After the 2012 election, you write in your book, you mentioned how Republicans gathered and sent out the memo saying that they need to be more diverse of a party. They need to reach out to underrepresented populations in a stronger manner and to get them aboard in the party. But Miller was part of a group in your book. You detail that they went the other way, had a whole new approach when he was working for Alabama Senator at the time, Jeff Sessions. So can you kind of share with us how his influence with the former senator and attorney general had on creating the campaign of Donald Trump into the powerhouse that it became in 2016?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, when he was, sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, it seemed that in 2012, after losing the election.
I remember. Okay. So this was like an incredibly important turning point as well, because the Republican Party had had this reckoning where that they decided that they had lost in 2012 because of their failure to appeal to enough people of color and their failure to be inclusive and diverse as a party. And they decided that, okay, you know what, we have to have this reckoning, and we need to start speaking to groups of people that we don't normally speak to. They put out an autopsy report stating these facts plainly. Stephen Miller, he has this fateful meeting with Bannon and his boss, Jeff Sessions at the time, where he brings to the table this analysis by Sean Trendy from Real Clear Politics that talks about the missing white voter. Sean Trendy was not saying that the Republicans should start appealing to white voters, but he was pointing out that there was this missing white voter, and that it wasn't so much about the Republican Party not appealing to enough people of color, but that a lot of white people had sat out the election, and that there was this missing white voter to contend with. So Stephen Miller comes to the table with this analysis and says, we actually have to do the opposite. We have to, rather than being more diverse and inclusive, we need to really double down on appealing to the white working class. And this is sort of what helps him to derail this historic bipartisan immigration compromise that Republicans and Democrats were working on in 2013 and 2014, where they were going to have, unprecedented new barriers and resources for Border Patrol, in addition to legalizing people who are in the country illegally in exchange for certain fees. It was a really give and take compromise. And Stephen Miller completely derailed it by painting anyone who supported it as agents of a donor class, of a corporate elite who is looking to decimate America through the limitless importation of cheap labor in the form of mass migration, which was a false narrative, obviously, because it ignores, when you're trying to legitimize a workforce, you have to pay them a fairer wage, and you can no longer exploit them. But this was a very effective narrative, and he went on to use it during the Trump campaign, painting immigrants as as a threat to American jobs, as a threat to American security, inserting really gory language into Trump's speeches, talking about migrants butchering little girls and things like that, just really evocative, horrible imagery. And also essentially characterizing the entire Democratic Party as globalist elites who just want cheap labor here. And it was a really effective false narrative that rallied people around Trump, who is, the embodiment of a corporate elite. But he was able to deflect that. Onto the Democratic Party through the arguments that Stephen Miller helped him use. And one really key thing about Stephen Miller is, like, because he grew up in a progressive city, in a liberal city, he's very good at identifying the hypocrisies in the Democratic Party and weaponizing them. And this is one of the ways that he was able to create this false narrative.
Now, the Republican field that Donald Trump had to run against in 2016 was sort of like the top up-and-coming candidates in the Republican Party. How was Miller and Trump able to keep the focus on immigration and trade during this campaign?
Well, I mean, there was a few different ways. One was just having this symbol that Trump had come up with, the border wall. It's like a very easy symbol to remember, and it seems like a simple solution. People want simple answers to their problems, and Trump was giving it to them. And then secondly, like, Stephen Miller, he initially cemented his status as a key player on the Trump campaign by getting him the Border Patrol and ICE union endorsements, which was unprecedented. The Border Patrol and ICE unions had never endorsed a presidential candidate before, and it really gave Trump serious law and order credentials, and gave a newfound sense of credibility to his argument that Americans faced a grave danger at the U.S.-Mexico border, and that he was the one who was going to be able to protect them from that. But it's a combination of, like, the way that Stephen Miller was shaping Trump's speeches, and also his alliances with Border Patrol and ICE, and this network of think tanks created by John Tanton, a eugenicist and white supremacist who believed in population control for non-white people and believed in the genetic superiority of whites. And he created these think tanks to make white supremacist ideas palatable to the mainstream. And they issued a bunch of immigration policy recommendations that Miller adopted almost verbatim for Trump's immigration plan, and then later on actually implementing them in the White House. So this gave Trump a lot of credentials with people. Miller really tried to stoke people's white fear and white resentment, and he was able to do that through the speeches and through the policies that he chose and his partnerships with white supremacists.
So how, with those relationships with the Border Patrol and ICE already built, how do you think Donald Trump is using Homeland Security when it comes to politics?
Well, so the Department of Homeland Security has been transformed into a political weapon. I mean, from day one of Miller's time in the White House, he began to narrow the focus of the Department of Homeland Security, which is supposed to be focused on protecting the American people from a broad range of threats, starting with terrorism to cyber warfare to public health crises like the pandemic, into something that was laser focused on family migration, keeping out asylum seekers, keeping out refugees, keeping out children and their parents, largely from non-white countries, Central America and African countries. So this was really about, even though Trump was saying that this was about cracking down on criminals, for Miller, it was about cracking down on anyone, like just any immigrant, because for him it was about re-engineering the democratic flows of brown and black people into this country, as I go into detail about in the book. But White House officials that I spoke to for the book say that this made it so that if any official ever tried to stray from this agenda and focus on other issues, they were removed or transferred out. Like right now, you see most of the top positions at the Department of Homeland Security either vacant or held by people in acting capacity, essentially puppets for Miller and Trump. And this has had broad Homeland Security consequences where it has left Americans more vulnerable to real threats, according to the officials I spoke to for the book, like terrorism, domestic terrorism, and now the pandemic. Instead of being focused on distributing masks and medical equipment, DHS has been focused on suspending green cards for immigrants, on shutting down the US-Mexico border, even though there were fewer cases in Mexico, on now expanding this war on immigrants to include anti-racist protesters in Portland, and really just constantly distracting from the real issues. In this case now being Trump's disastrous response to the coronavirus crisis.
Yeah, speaking of COVID-19, I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on how the lack of those key roles in Homeland Security being filled has impacted the response to COVID-19. I mean, can you share with us some things that maybe were possible for the Trump administration to do as far as crack down on harsh policies when it comes to migration?
Yeah, I mean, so the administration was really focusing on finding ways to increase detention capacity for DHS. So increasing agents' ability to keep people locked up, even if they're kids or parents, and even if they prove that they have a credible fear of persecution and will show up in court. And also on increasing agents' ability to deport people, regardless of their credible fear designation. And so this, so this is what the administration has been focused on. And you saw like early, at one point during the administration, they did divert funds from FEMA's disaster preparedness response funds for migrant detention. So like from early on, before this pandemic was even starting, they were diverting funds away from other areas where they could respond to things like pandemics, in order to keep families locked up and to support policies like the family separation policy, where hundreds of children were systematically torn away from their parents. But Stephen Miller's, his approach to DHS and his approach to governing has really been about like slashing refugee admissions to historic lows, a new historic low every year, and completely obliterating the asylum system at the US-Mexico border through a variety of different means.
Now, you're somebody who's covered the border for quite some time. You've seen the impact of these policies. Can you share with us some of the stories and issues that you've seen face to face and how these policies impact people who are seeking refuge?
Yeah, I can't tell you how many mothers and fathers that I spoke to who just had nowhere to turn and were, found themselves stuck in Mexico after making this incredibly dangerous journey from, parts of Central America, in some cases, even farther away, traveling overseas from the Democratic Republic of Congo, arriving at the US-Mexico border with this idea, I have evidence that I was being persecuted or had death threats at home, and the United States is a beacon of hope and refuge in the world, and I'm going to try to go through this process, and then not even being allowed through the port of entry and being told, sorry, we're closed, we're full. This is unprecedented in the history of the United States. I mean, we're just systematically turning away people without even giving any consideration to their claims. And after they've spent money, I mean, often these people have spent all of the money that they have. They've gathered their few $100 or whatever they have to make this dangerous, long journey. And then they get here and they're told, you're out of luck. You can't even be under consideration. And so it's had a huge impact on people's lives, and it's led to, people taking really desperate measures, crossing illegally when they wouldn't have otherwise, and dying in the desert because of the dehydration or drowning, trying to cross the Rio Grande. These people, like, they come here because they feel it's necessary for their survival, and oftentimes they're willing to take desperate means to get here, and that they wouldn't have necessarily had to if they could have just done it the legal route, which Stephen Miller, as I show in the book, has completely obliterated.
We just have under 2 minutes left, but I want to ask you, how do you think this action by the Trump administration to really crack down on refugees with harsh policies and immigration has impacted the United States' status in the world?
I think it has done enormous damage. From my conversations with people, it's going to have permanent impact. Even if Trump doesn't win re-election in November, they have dismantled entire infrastructures that were meant to process refugees, and it takes a lot of time and resources to rebuild these infrastructures back up. These offices, people who were laid off, sent home, it was easy to destroy, but it's not going to be easy to rebuild. And so this is going to have long-lasting consequences. People no longer see the United States as a beacon of hope and refuge the way it has historically been seen. And that really is Stephen Miller's legacy, is regardless of what happens in November, he has already very effectively transformed the way that the United States is seen across the world because of his campaign to keep out brown and Black people, and the way that has impacted real lives.
Well, Jean, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for joining us. Jean Guerrero, her new book is Hatemonger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump and the White Nationalist Agenda. Thank you so much for joining us, Jean Guerrero.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we want to thank you for joining us for Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.